for his people and about exactly what God is willing to do on behalf of those who put their faith and their trust in him. So, in order to take that lesson, let's read Joshua chapter 10, verses 1 through 14, and then we'll make some comments. Joshua chapter 10, beginning in verse 1. As soon as Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard how Joshua had captured Ai and had devoted it to destruction, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were warriors. So Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hoham, king of Hebron, to Piram, king of Jarmuth, to Japhiah, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon, saying, "Come up to me and help me, and let us strike Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the people of Israel." Then the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered their forces and went up with all their armies and encamped against Gibeon and made war against it. And the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp in Gilgal, saying, "Do not relax your hand from your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the hill country have gathered against us." So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not a man of them shall stand before you." So Joshua came upon them suddenly, having marched all night from Gilgal. And the Lord threw them into a panic before Israel, who struck them with a great blow at Gibeon and chased them by the way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And as they fled before Israel, while they were going down the ascent of Beth Horon, the Lord threw down large stones from heaven as far as Azekah, and they died. And there were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the sword. At that time, Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon." As the moon stood still, and the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher, "The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day"? There has not been a day like it before or since, when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. All right. So let's go back and make some comments on these verses. Quickly, though, do we have the recording going? Because I realized as I was reading that, thank you, Lucy, I forgot to do my recording on my end, so at least we got it one way. So making some quick comments on chapter 10, verses 1 through 14. So if we look at verses 1 through 5, the vulnerabilities that are left in Israel's game plan here because of this pact that they made with the Gibeonites. We talked last week about God. And so we talked about how after having entered into this covenant, of course, under false pretenses with the Gibeonites, the Israelites are now obliged to keep their covenant with the Gibeonites. And we talked about some of the reasons for that last week. But we see here that already this covenant that Israel has made with the Gibeonites creates a vulnerability. They have a walled city now to defend, and so that gives you a certain offensive capability, but it's also a defensive liability. So Adonai-Zedek, who was the king of Jerusalem, and this is when Jerusalem would have been inhabited by Canaanites. And scholars think that Jerusalem has been continually occupied long before the children of Israel came to inhabit it. There were Canaanite people who'd been living in the city for a very long time, and they're now afraid because they see already Israel had the power of God, and now they have the added fighting capabilities of the Gibeonites. But the king of Jerusalem also recognizes that part of what Israel's advantage has been up to this point is that they don't have any fixed address, right? They're a nomadic people. They've been wandering. They've been living as a nomadic people with no permanent cities to defend, so they can pop up anywhere on the map. And that's sort of what gives Israel the advantage. They're sort of guerrilla fighters, right? But now they're obliged to defend the Gibeonites, and the Gibeonites have cities. So this gives the Canaanite king of Jerusalem a point at which to mount his attack. So he summons all the other kings to join him in attacking Jerusalem. We see that in verses 3 through 4. And this is one of the things that we know about Satan, and we've talked about it through our study of Joshua, is that he combines his forces with the world and with the flesh, and they come at us in a unified front. And we talked some in the last few weeks about how the forces that oppose us unify against us when we rededicate ourselves to God and to his purposes. And so this is why we're told in the New Testament that this world is not our home, that we're sojourners. You could say that we're spiritual nomads. Because if you have a home, if you have a walled city, if you have a fixed point of address here on this earth, then Satan has somewhere to come after. In Job, when Satan is trying to entice Job to abandon God, what does he go after? He goes after the things that Job loves the most, the things that keep him attached to his life here on this earth. They're his possessions, his wealth, his love of his family, and finally his health and his own body, right? And Job finds at the end that his attachments to all these things are vain. It's not that they don't have temporary value. They do have great value. But it's that our lives here and nothing about them, our lives are temporary. And so when we're blessed with good fortune, we rejoice, but we recognize that these things are not permanent. These things that we love will end, like everything that we know. And so we must let go of them in order to gain our true life. We give Satan nothing to attack. Release your attachments to this life. This is what Jesus spoke about when he talked about trying to plow and look back, having put one's hand to the plow, the impossibility of turning back. Because of course, if you're trying to plow a row and you're craning your neck to look back, you're gonna row or plow a crooked row. And so you've been called out of death, out of the world, out of the death that is in the life of the world and of the flesh. So do not plow a crooked row. Do not look back. Don't be turned into a pillar of salt like Lot's wife. Give Satan no walled cities to attack. Have no attachments here. But this weakness that the Israelites now have because of this pact that they made with the Gibeonites, it is, like so many other things in Scripture, going to become the occasion with which God demonstrates his power. So the other side of this is that the enemies of God, the enemies of the children of God, are now all massed at one point. We see in verse 5. They're all going to come at them in this sort of unified way at Gibeon. So as God often does, he's going to use this instance of man's weakness to his advantage, to the fulfillment of his ultimate will. So the Israelites have messed up in a big way. They've made this covenant with the Gibeonites, and this adds to their strategic liabilities. But God doesn't just tell them, or he didn't just tell them initially, to wipe out the inhabitants of the land because he's mean and because he likes to be mean and vengeful. God did it so that they would prosper. He told them to wipe out the people of the land so that they would not be pulled away from him by the concerns of pagan cultures that did not know God. So the Israelites have already messed up on that front. There is a remnant of Gentiles, of Canaanites, that are now among their camp. And by the way, all of these Gentiles, these Canaanites who have found mercy, have done so when they came before God, expressing their faith in Israel's God. But they, nevertheless, the complete destruction that God prescribed has already sort of gone out the window. But God says, very well, my plan won't be thwarted. I will use the weakness as an occasion to demonstrate my faithfulness. So, because the Gibeonites require this aid, the Israelites are going to come to their aid. And God is going to assist them in dramatic fashion. He's going to rain down fire from the sky. And in verse 6, we see, again, they've just made this pact with the Gibeonites, and the Gibeonites are already requesting help, right? They've just entered into this covenant, and the Gibeonites already require aid. We've already made the point that that the Gibeonites were a liability here, and that our spiritual walled cities, our spiritual liabilities, these are liabilities to us on our walk with Christ. But we can't advance if we're constantly being pulled back by cares of the world. But also note here how quickly the world calls to us, needing something from us, right? It's not like we make a deal with the world and the world gives us lots of nice things in return to help us. No, the world wants to weigh you down and keep you on this rock where you don't belong. And we talked last week, you'll remember, about the faith of the Gibeonites, that they believed in a God who kept his promises. And we talked about how we're all in the position of the Gibeonites in a way when we bring our deceitful selves before God and we confess our need for him, our need for protection from him. And so here we see the extension of that idea. When we come to our Joshua, our Yeshua, our Jesus, it's because we are in peril. And if we're no longer in peril of his judgment, then we are in peril of being pulled back in and overcome by the world. So what do? We ask him to deliver us. He is a deliverer, Christ is. So in the same way that Jesus leads us to through the power of God, Joshua will lead the children of Israel in God's power and display God's powerful will in a very impressive way. In verse 7, we see the children of God keep their word just like their God does, and they're ready to fight. We don't see any hesitation here on the part of Joshua. He leads the camp to the fight. And so even though we're deceitful and needy like the Gibeonites, Christ unhesitatingly fights for us, leading the Lord's army into battle. And if we have a Christ that doesn't hesitate to fight for us, then we better be ready to fight. And not just to fight for any reason. We're not to be contentious people, but to fight for those who are troubled, for those who are imperiled. This is specifically who Joshua is going to bat for here. And how do we fight for these people? How do we fight for the troubled and the imperiled? We teach them the gospel. We let the example of Christ work through us. And when we do that, we deliver them from the conspiring forces of Satan and the world and the flesh. And then in verses 8 through 9, we see that with God at his back, Joshua has superhuman strength. Look at 8 through 9. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear them, for I've given them into your hands. Not a man of them shall stand before you." This echoes the assurances that God has given Joshua already on many occasions. And so Joshua came upon them suddenly, having marched all night from Gilgal. So as soon as Joshua gets this assurance, this word from God, they embark on this all-night march. This is some 30 miles they march to Gilgal. So God says to Joshua, "You can't lose. I've given them into your hand." And so they're able to go on this long march. And we should frequently remind ourselves we can't lose. God has given the victory into our hands. So what is the immediate result of this assurance of victory from God? It's swift action on Joshua's part towards God's purposes. So when we know that God is at our back, that his armies support us, that the Lord's army supports us, and that God's work is the work that we're doing, even when the work is hard, it becomes easy to do the work. This march was hard. This march was about 30 miles in the dark. It doesn't matter. God's power is about to be shown to all, and so there is a urgency, a quickness, a hurry to getting to the point of battle, getting to the field, and we should approach it the same way. Have you ever been working on a task, maybe something you aren't familiar with? Let's say you're putting together a piece of furniture. This happens with me a lot when I'm trying to put together like a piece of IKEA furniture or something, right? You're not familiar with how to do it, but you're teaching yourself how to do it. And you feel it's going okay as you start. And then as you put more and more pieces together, you're saying, all right, we're moving here. It's going better and better and better. And you get this sort of sense of accomplishment. And by the end, you're singing your own praises and you want to show everybody your work, right? That's how it goes when we're learning something, when we're putting something together. But when we have divine reassurance, it affects our performance in an endless loop, right? This is what our spiritual walk should be like. As we grow, it feels good to grow, and we desire to grow more. It's in the same way that when you eat something that tastes really delicious, you want to eat more and more, right? Until you get your fill. This is what our spiritual walk should be, and we should want to replenish our spiritual nourishment frequently. We're thrown into action by the confidence we gain in Christ, and it's modeled to us by the swift action that Joshua takes. In verse 10, we see Joshua has the ultimate weapon of surprise. Joshua has a secret weapon that nobody knows about. Joshua's eager to get to the fight because he has a secret weapon. What will that weapon do? Well, what about the ability to throw the enemy into a complete irrational panic on a whim, which nobody can find an obvious cause or explanation for? Talk about psychological warfare. You don't think our generals would literally kill to have that kind of a weapon, to be able to spontaneously throw the enemy into a panic? Well, that's what God does for Joshua in verse 10. And this is already in verse 10. What God does for Joshua is already a miracle, right? Because in a minute, God is going to do something miraculous involving planetary bodies. But before he even does that, he performs a miracle using the minds of the enemy. One of the things that confounds modern science, for all that we know, and we do know a lot now, but modern scientists still don't even begin to understand the brain or consciousness. And most of what they do understand tells us that consciousness is primarily a sense-making function, right? So our minds construct habitable order out of the chaos of the world. Most of our brain's work is not so much taking in information, but blocking information out. So that consciousness, which scientists puzzle over today, can be taken off its tracks by God, so to speak. God sees and knows the innermost parts of man. And that means our minds, our emotions, our thoughts, even the things we try to hide from ourselves, God knows them. And if he wants to, he can cause a whole army to fly into a panic so that without any offensive being launched in battle, the battle's already won. But God will launch an offensive. God's not done defeating the enemies of God's people here, because in verse 11, we see God's power over nature. God causes rocks to fall out of the sky and crush the enemies of his children, the enemies of the children of Israel. There's debate about what exactly the nature of these stones falling from the sky were. You could think about them as meteorite material, or literally just rocks that God miraculously causes to fall from the sky. I think either could be a plausible explanation, but it's interesting. I saw a video of meteorites, several videos actually, of meteorites falling this past month because it's been happening a lot. And it's really scary to see a giant burning rock falling from the sky, and then when they land, they're glowing hot, and they seem like they'd be no fun to be crushed by. But even these, terrifying things that fall from the sky sometimes, they're under God's power. The stones from the sky here are under God's power. And the text goes out of its way to say that the rocks that fell from the sky killed more people than the Israelites. So God is doing all the load-bearing work here when it comes to vanquishing the enemy for the children of Israel. So when we come to actually do battle with the enemies that wish to pull us back into the world, that wish to undermine our salvation and overcome us with darkness, it's going to be God that's doing all the real work. And this is a blessing, actually. We don't have to worry about all the responsibility of the work of winning this cosmic battle between good and evil. We take instead the manageable responsibility of winning the battle of our individual lives, with God doing the work to help us, right? So the battle between good and evil, the battle between God and Satan, has already been won. We don't have to worry about that one. All we have to concern ourselves with is the struggle that is our lives and living our lives in the way that we ought. And so Joshua is able to secure the victory here because his God had power over nature and could control and mold nature to suit his will, just as he uses the inner thoughts and motivations of human beings to do his will as well. And we serve this same God, and he can do just as much as he did then. We can have just as much confidence in him now as they did then to secure our victory for us. So God's already demonstrated his power over nature. He's rained fire and stones from the sky, but he's not done. He's not finished demonstrating his power, as we see in verses 12 through 14, because our God is not just a God who controls nature and who gives merciful deliverance, but he's a God who gives grace on top of grace. The battle is already won here. The enemy's been thrown into a panic, and they've been crushed by these falling stones from the sky, and they're being slaughtered by Israel. And yet, God gives them extra time to have vengeance over their enemies. And how does he do that? Well, he only stops the course of the sun and moon in the sky, right? Check out verse 12 again. Verses 12 and 13. And at that time, Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped until the nations took vengeance on their enemies. So Joshua's God has power not just over nature in a general sense, but even over the huge, intricate, ordered processes of nature, the orbits of the planets. Someone might say, as far as God making stones fall out of the sky, that's a nice magic trick. But, stones fall from the sky sometimes by natural causes. We know this. And so this is a miracle that has a natural explanation. And to those people, God says, I've got another one to show you. Because God does something here that if you take a look at the commentary on this, people still tie themselves in knots trying to explain this impossible thing that God does. And it is impossible on every level what God does here. So what we know from the text is that from a standing on the earth perspective, what it looked like was that the sun stopped at noon, or at its highest point, and did not hasten or lingered in the sky much longer than the normal course of a day. The text says it was a period of about a day. So in Jewish thought, that would have equaled about 12 hours of daylight in a day. So in other words, you have a day in which the sun rises at its usual rate, and then seems to proceed from the midpoint toward its set for an extra 12-hour period for a total of around 18 hours of daylight. So many of us, especially now here in California when the days are so short, might long for an 18-hour day, right? Because it seems like as soon as the sun comes up in December here in California, the sun goes back down. But this is not something that happens here or in Israel's part of the world. You would never see a period of daylight that long unless the Earth slowed on its orbit, on its axis. The only problem with that is that it's impossible for the Earth to slow its rotation on its axis, because that's what creates gravity. We're all stuck to this rock by the force that's generated when the rock turns on its axis. So if that slows, stuff should start to come unstuck, right? This is a miracle so profound that physicists would say, if it really happened, it should have destroyed life on Earth and this planet altogether. But this is the God we serve, who reveals his power in increasingly dramatic fashion. Not only does he control the mind, not only does he control the strange natural forces that we have difficulty predicting, like asteroids or meteorites, but he controls the Earth's rotation and the planetary courses. The Canaanite people, like the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, they had a sky pantheon of gods. So that means that they had gods corresponding to the sun and the moon, and they believed deeply in astrology as having power to predict the course of human events and control the fate of human lives. They thought that the stars controlled people's destinies. And here, God gives them a live demonstration that everything, even the sun, moon, and stars, yield to his power. Everything exists within his power and his will. And Joshua's God, has the power to make the accounts of this deed famous, we see in verse 13. Because the story was written about elsewhere. We have mention of the book of Jasher, which is most scholars believe an ancient text, a historical text that is now lost to us. We don't have a copy of it. But it was documented elsewhere, the reports of this long day. And there are ancient accounts from other cultures from around this time also of a long day. As we've advanced through this book, Joshua has been getting more and more famous. And now that this has happened, well, can you imagine? The leader of the Israelites serves a God who not only gave him the victory over Jericho and brought the walls down miraculously, not only miraculously ambushed his enemies at Ai, but Joshua, the leader of the Israelites, serves a God who stopped the sun in the sky so that the Israelites could finish slaughtering their enemies. That is a God that means business, and a God that does battle for mortal human beings, for failing human beings. And that's the point of verse 14. We see that Joshua's God, with all this power, did it all at the beckoning of one mortal man. The last thing we hear about this incident is this re-emphasis of this aspect of it, that God did it because a human being who believed asked him to. We serve a God who honors the requests of his servants. When you ask him for something, he hears you. And he doesn't just hear you, he hears you and acts in spectacular fashion. Even if we don't always see or understand the ways that God works behind the scenes for us, I think this story is here to show us that there is nothing that he wouldn't do for us. There's nothing beyond his power and nothing he's not willing to do for us. Jesus' miracles, if you study them, are demonstrations of his power, but they're always directed for people. They're always toward a human being, right? there's healings, there are demons that are cast out by Jesus, and these things show that he is the Son of God and that he's divine, but they're also an act of compassion on a person who's suffering in most cases. There's someone receiving a life-changing benefit in most of Jesus's miracles. There's someone who Christ looks on with compassion, someone who believes despite their own frailty and their own failings. So our God came to earth as a person on behalf of people, to live for people, to die for people. And his greatest miracle of all, the fact that we can come to God at all through him, was for the people, for us, for our benefit. He would stop the sun in the sky for us. He would also send his son to die for us. Both are equally improbable. Both were gifts that he gladly gave his children. God would and can and does do everything that we can imagine and much, much more. And the limitations that we have in our minds on what God can do are always going to be broken, because God can always and will always do more than we can ask or imagine. And that's important to remember, even in difficult times, even in times like we're experiencing right now, where the way forward for our state, for our country, for our world seems uncertain. Let's never forget that our God is a God of miracles, a God of improbable miracles, who can and does routinely make amazing things happen against all odds, and who gives those who love him grace on top of grace, improbable grace that thwarts even the natural forces which we think of as being unstoppable, like the sun, like the moon, like the stars. God is over them all. That's all I had today on Joshua 10, verses 1 through 14. Next week, we're going to begin our discussion of Joshua's further conquest of the land. And then once the land has been taken, the dedication of the people toward the land's purpose, what God had intended for them to use the land for. And that's what we're going to focus on for the remainder of our studies through Joshua. And we're going to cover some of the rest of the book in bigger chunks, because there's some summarizing that happens in the narrative, and there's some broad groups of people taking different parts of the land that are covered. But I think they're important lessons for us to take even from these parts of the book. And so I look forward to breaking those down with you and making some applications from them. And I hope you will also join us tonight, where I'm going to bring you a lesson from Psalm 90. That's where we're going to take our lesson from tonight. And I also have, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what I want to do with the Sunday evening sermons going forward. And I think you'll enjoy what I have in mind there. So if there are any who need to respond, who have a spiritual need, who require prayer, please make that known, and we would be happy to pray for you. We would be happy to help you or give you counsel in any way that you need. And if you would like to become a child of God today, if you'd like to be baptized into his family, into his fold, won't you please make that known, and we will accommodate you. Please, if you have any need, won't you come forward or make your needs known as we sing the song that has been announced.